Teacher tries to shame quiet black student. Turns out he's a math genius. The morning sun filtered softly through the tall windows of Westridge Middle School, casting golden lines across the scuffed tiles of room 206. It was early autumn in Atlanta, Georgia, and the air had that crisp bite that made the leaves outside dance lazily in the wind. Inside, the classroom buzzed with teenage energy, zippers unzipped. Backpacks thudded against desks. Voices carried in half whispers and laughter. It was just another math period at a typical American public school. But near the back, in the last row by the window, sat Malik, 13 years old, quiet and observant. Malik was the kind of student teachers often forgot to call on. He never caused trouble, never spoke out of turn. But he didn't volunteer either. He simply existed, or at least that's how it appeared, with skin the shade of warm chestnut and eyes that always seemed lost in thought. Malik spent his mornings half in the classroom, half beyond the glass, watching the world drift by. While his peers whispered about video games or Friday's football game, he watched the sky shift colors, the birds settle and scatter. In front of him, a worn-out spiral notebook lay open, its edges curled and faded. It looked empty at first glance. Just a few notes scribbled here and there, but hidden in the back pages, scrawled between creases and coffee stains, were complex equations and number puzzles that far exceeded anything taught in 8th grade. Malik didn't solve these problems because someone told him to. He solved them because they whispered to him, like secret codes waiting to be cracked. Math wasn't just a subject. It was the language of how things worked, a quiet kind of magic. And Malik, though no one had ever told him so, was fluent in it. He never bragged, never shared, not out of shyness, but out of a deeper instinct, one formed from years of watching how quickly brilliance in the wrong skin could be mistaken for arrogance. Or worse, rebellion. He'd seen kids like him misunderstood before, labeled as distracted, difficult, or disrespectful, so Malik learned to disappear. His talent remained his own private world, scribbled in margins and memorized before sleep. That morning, like all others, he kept to his routine, quiet, unnoticed, invisible by design. But there was something in the air, a shift, a pause between breaths. He could feel it, not in a dramatic, cinematic way, but in the subtle tension that sometimes shows up just before the unexpected. He couldn't explain why, but as the rustle of backpacks faded and Mrs. Thompson stepped to the front of the room, something inside Malik tensed, a hunch, a flicker. He opened his notebook to a fresh page, pencil in hand. Outside, a leaf spiraled down, brushing the glass before vanishing. Inside, the classroom settled into a stillness that would not last. Malik didn't know it yet, but the world was about to turn its eyes toward him. And for the first time, he wouldn't look away. Mrs. Thompson stood at the front of the room like a sentinel, arms crossed, expression unreadable, her gaze sweeping across the rows of desks with a practiced sharpness honed over decades in the classroom. Her tailored blazer hugged her frame precisely, her hair pulled into a bun so tight it seemed to bristle with tension. The stack of graded tests on her desk was a visible wound, red ink bleeding across more papers than not, numbers circled, problems marked wrong, careless mistakes highlighted like personal offenses. She had seen worse, of course. Years in public education had taught her to temper her expectations. But today the results struck a nerve. Perhaps it was the effort she had poured into this unit, endless review sessions, detailed examples, even one-on-one help. Yet still, so many of them had fumbled the basics. She wasn't angry, not exactly. Disappointed, yes, but more than anything, she was determined, and someone needed to be made an example of. Her voice sliced through the lazy murmur of the classroom like a blade. "All right," she said, "let's talk about what went wrong." Chairs stopped shifting, pens stilled. Even the students who usually ignored her had the sense to look up. "This test was not meant to trick you," she continued, lifting the stack from her desk and tapping it against her palm. "It was basic algebra, concepts we've reviewed for weeks. And yet, more than half the class scored below 70. A few heads bowed. A cough echoed from the back. "This isn't just about grades. This is about discipline, about effort, about showing up with your mind switched on, not drifting through the day like." Her eyes locked on a figure at the far end of the room. "Like you." Mr. Malik Carter. It was a tone that carried weight, not angry, but layered with the kind of sharp concern that stung more than a shout. Malik blinked, his pencil freezing mid-sketch. He hadn't even noticed she was talking until his name landed like a stone in the center of the room. He looked up slowly, met her gaze, then glanced around as heads turned in unison toward him. "You seem particularly uninterested," she said. "Perhaps you'd like to demonstrate your understanding, since you clearly find the rest of this beneath you." There was a beat of silence. Malik didn't answer. His heart had begun to beat faster, though his face remained composed. Mrs. Thompson set the tests down and strode to the whiteboard. She uncapped a marker, paused for effect, and then began to write. Her strokes were swift, deliberate, almost theatrical. Variables, fractions, exponents. This wasn't a review problem. It was complex, layered, something pulled from a high school honors curriculum. When she stepped aside, the equation loomed like a challenge issued not just to Malik, but to the entire room. "Come up," she said, her voice calm but firm. "Show us what you've got." The room rippled with tension. A few students stifled laughter. Others whispered under their breath. Malik sat frozen for a moment. Then, slowly, he pushed back his chair. It scraped against the floor, a harsh sound that broke the silence like a crack of thunder. He stood, every movement measured, as if trying not to disturb some delicate balance. His palms were damp, his stomach coiled. He wasn't afraid of the math. He was afraid of being watched, of being expected to prove something, and in doing so, losing the small corner of invisibility he'd carved for himself. As he walked to the front, the whispers grew bolder. "Watch this," someone muttered. "Bet he doesn't even know what half of that means." Another voice chimed in with a soft chuckle. "He's toast." Malik heard it all. He felt it in the weight of their eyes. The smirks, the thinly veiled expectation of failure. But he said nothing. He reached the whiteboard and stood still for a breath. Then another. The marker was in Mrs. Thompson's hand. She offered it to him without expression. He took it, up close. The problem didn't look less intimidating. In fact, it sprawled across the board like a warning. Malik stared at it, letting his mind trace its structure, feeling the rhythm in its variables, the symmetry hiding beneath its surface. He could almost hear it hum, like a tune waiting to be played. But behind him, the room simmered with anticipation, with judgment, with every teenage insecurity condensed into a few short seconds. Mrs. Thompson folded her arms. "Any time now," she said. Her voice wasn't mocking, but it carried the chill of expectation. Malik raised the marker. His hand trembled, just slightly. Then he lowered it, stepping back. The laughter began to swell again, low, hushed, but vicious in its timing. "He's backing out," someone whispered. I knew it. But Malik wasn't backing out. He was breathing, counting, clearing the fog. Then he turned back to the board, stepped forward again, and pressed the marker to the surface. He didn't speak. He just began to write. Behind him, the room gradually fell silent, not out of respect, but curiosity, because what Malik wrote wasn't wrong. In fact, it was precise, elegant. His first line simplified the outer structure of the equation. The second isolated a variable. The third introduced a substitution technique that, to most of his classmates, looked like sorcery. Mrs. Thompson's brows lifted, just slightly. The chatter stopped. The energy in the room shifted, subtly but unmistakably. Malik was no longer a background figure. He was commanding the space. And yet, his face betrayed nothing. He moved with quiet confidence, line after line unfolding from his mind to the board like a ribbon being unspooled. He didn't look back, didn't react. The marker squeaked against the surface, echoing in the heavy stillness. Even the ones who had laughed began to lean forward, whispering, "Wait, he's actually doing it." One girl gasped under her breath. "Is that even the right method?" Mrs. Thompson said nothing. She watched, arms crossed, her face unreadable. When Malik reached the end, he paused, checked his steps, circled the final answer. Then, without flourish, he capped the marker and set it down. Only then did he turn to face the room. His eyes scanned the class, but not with defiance, with quiet readiness. He had not set out to prove anything. But he just did. Malik stood at the whiteboard, the marker in his hand feeling strangely weightless. like something borrowed, like something not meant for him. The equation loomed before him, not just as a problem to solve but a test, a silent wager placed by everyone behind him, by the teacher who handed him the marker, by the classmates who whispered and waited for him to fold. He felt their eyes, their breath, their doubt. He'd been in this room for months, maybe years, and somehow had never been seen. Not really. Now, all it took was a single problem to thrust him into view. The math itself didn't scare him. It rarely did. What scared him was exposure. Being watched, being judged, being noticed for something more than just the kid who sat quietly in the back. He let the seconds pass. Let the equation settle into his mind like dust finding the floor. Then, with the smallest movement, he began. The first line came slowly. Simple simplification, rewriting terms, reordering variables, nothing to impress, just control. His handwriting was clean, deliberate. The marker squeaked faintly against the board. From behind, the room breathed, just barely. Some still whispered, but the tone was shifting, from ridicule to confusion, from amusement to curiosity. His second line built on the first. Then the third. His hand moved faster, more confidently, not with swagger, but with flow. The kind of rhythm that only comes when the mind isn't forcing understanding, but simply letting it unfold. Every step carried purpose. He wasn't just solving the equation. He was disassembling it, peeling it apart, like a mechanic quietly restoring an engine while the garage stood watching, doubting he knew how to hold a wrench. Somewhere behind him, a voice murmured, "Wait," and didn't finish the sentence. Desks creaked as students leaned forward. Mrs. Thompson hadn't moved. Her arms remained folded, but her face had changed, brows raised, mouth slightly parted, just enough to betray her surprise. She was watching him not as a teacher evaluating a student, but as someone witnessing something she hadn't accounted for. Malik's lines multiplied. He introduced a method no one else in the room would have thought to use, not from arrogance, but from instinct, from hours spent doing this on his own, in silence, in shadows. His private world now spilled across a public canvas. The quiet kid was making noise without saying a word, and the classroom, used to chaos and chatter, was suddenly reverent. No one laughed now, no one smirked. He reached the last step, reviewed it once, twice, then circled the final answer with a single, clean stroke. The marker clicked closed. He placed it gently on the ledge. Still facing the board, he took a breath. His shoulders were steady, not defiant, not triumphant, just sure. When he finally turned, his eyes swept the room, and everything felt still. No applause, no jeers, just that charged silence, the kind that lingers after a truth no one expected has been spoken. For the first time, Malik wasn't invisible, and he hadn't said a word. Mrs. Thompson rose from her chair slowly, almost as if unwilling to trust what she had just witnessed. Her heels tapped lightly against the linoleum floor as she approached the whiteboard. Eyes locked on the maze of numbers and symbols Malik had left behind. Her gaze was sharp, practiced, the gaze of a teacher who had spent years deciphering student work, but now it was tinged with something else. Wonder, skepticism, a quiet reckoning. She examined each step in silence, following his logic backward, line by line. Nothing wavered, no shortcuts, no mistakes. Each line was clear, concise, mathematically sound, the kind of solution you don't expect to see on a whiteboard in a middle school classroom. She took a step back, still staring at the board. "This is perfect," she said, her voice soft, almost disbelieving, then louder. Every step, flawless. A stunned hush held the room for a moment longer before. Unexpectedly, applause erupted, not loud at first, but it grew, timid claps turning into a full wave of sound as the students processed what had just happened. There were no instructions, no nudges. It was involuntary, the kind of reaction that couldn't be faked. Malik had done something none of them could have imagined, and now the room couldn't help but respond. Malik stood still, his back to the board, the echo of clapping folding around him like a wave of heat. He didn't smile, but something inside him cracked open, quietly, subtly. He looked up, not to seek validation, but because, for the first time, he felt like he didn't have to hide. The stares no longer made him shrink. They didn't feel like judgment. They felt like something closer to recognition. Students who had barely noticed him before were now leaning in, whispering to each other in disbelief. "Did you see what he just did?" one girl said. "Bro, that was actually insane," someone else muttered. Even the kids who'd made snide remarks just minutes earlier were silent now, their faces a mix of confusion and reluctant respect. Mrs. Thompson turned to face him, her expression unreadable for a moment. Then it softened, just slightly, in that way adults sometimes do when they realize they've misjudged someone. "Where did you learn that?" she asked. Malik looked down briefly. "I just figured it out," he said quietly. She blinked. No trace of sarcasm, no follow-up challenge, just silence. Then she looked at the rest of the class. "What you just saw wasn't luck," she said. "That was real understanding. That's what it looks like when someone doesn't just memorize steps, but actually sees the problem, breaks it down, owns it." The weight of her words filled the room like fog settling in. No one spoke. No one needed to. Malik walked back to his seat, a few classmates patting his shoulder as he passed. The sound of their approval wasn't loud, but it was honest. He sat down quietly, notebook still open on his desk. His hands, which had trembled earlier, were steady now. At the front of the room, Mrs. Thompson glanced once more at the board, then back at Malik. Her eyes held something unspoken, not just respect, but possibility, as if in that moment, she wasn't just seeing a student anymore, but something larger, something beginning. And for the first time, Malik wasn't looking out the window. He was looking forward. The classroom had emptied in waves, backpacks slung over shoulders, chairs scraped back with hurried motions, the door swinging shut again and again as voices faded down the hallway. But Malik remained. He stood near his desk, notebook pressed loosely against his side, while Mrs. Thompson gathered a few papers from the front. She didn't look up at first. The silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable, but uncertain, like two people standing on the edge of a conversation neither had rehearsed. When she finally turned, her expression was softer than he had ever seen. The sternness she wore like armor during class had been stripped away, leaving behind something heavier, honest. She folded her arms, not in judgment, but in thought. Her eyes, sharp just hours earlier, were clouded now with something else. She sighed, gently, and took a few steps closer. "Malik," she began, voice lower than usual, "I need to say something I don't often say to students." He didn't respond, just stood there, waiting, bracing. "I misjudged you," she said plainly. From the very beginning, he blinked, unsure whether to speak. No one had ever told him that, not a teacher, not an adult. Most people moved on from their assumptions like they were facts. She didn't rush the next part. "I thought your silence meant you didn't care. That your eyes drifting to the window were signs of distraction, not depth. And today, you proved just how wrong I was." The words landed with a quiet weight, not heavy, but solid, like stones placed carefully, not thrown. She looked at him for a long moment. Malik shifted slightly, not out of discomfort, but from the unfamiliarity of it all. He had spent so much time learning how not to be seen that being seen now felt almost overwhelming. She continued, her voice steady. "I've been teaching for a long time, and I like to think I know how to read students. But with you, I didn't look deep enough. I made assumptions based on what you didn't say, instead of what you might have been trying to tell me in other ways." She paused again, then said it, simply, honestly, "I'm sorry." The word hung there, rare and unexpected. Mrs. Thompson didn't apologize. Not to students. Not often. Not ever. Really. But there it was, laid bare in the air between them. Malik didn't quite know what to do with it. A part of him wanted to shrug it off, to say it didn't matter, that it was fine. But it did matter, and somehow, it wasn't fine. So he nodded, once, not as permission, but as acknowledgement. She seemed to take that as enough, because she let out a slow breath and stepped back. "You have something, Malik," she said then, not as praise, but as recognition, a gift, something most kids don't have, and some adults spend their whole lives trying to find. You see things differently, you think differently, and that's not something to hide. He glanced down at the notebook in his hand, its pages worn, the corners bent from months of being flipped, rewritten, erased, started again. For the longest time, It had been his escape. His proof, to himself, not to others, that he was capable. He never expected anyone else to care about what was in it. "I want to help you," she said, "if you're willing. There are programs, competitions, mentorships. You don't have to figure this all out on your own." Malik's fingers tightened slightly around the notebook. The idea of stepping into something bigger, outside the familiar solitude of his thoughts, was thrilling and terrifying all at once. But more than that, it was the fact that she was offering. Not pushing, not forcing, offering. And it wasn't about a grade anymore. It wasn't about behavior. It was about belief. He looked up, met her gaze fully for the first time. "Okay," he said, just one word, but in it, there was something new, not just agreement, but trust. And maybe, for the first time, the beginning of being understood. The kitchen smelled faintly of rice and reheated chicken. The kind of quiet meal reserved for long days and late nights. The overhead light flickered once before settling into a soft, steady glow, casting gentle shadows on the scuffed linoleum floor. Malik sat at the small square table, his backpack slumped beside him, the familiar weight of his notebook resting in front of him like an old friend. Across from him, his mother moved with slow, practiced grace, her scrubs still wrinkled from the evening shift, her name tag hanging slightly askew. She poured herself a glass of water, then sat down, her tired eyes scanning his face. He hadn't said much since getting home, just a quiet, "Hey, Ma," and a longer than usual hug that told her something had shifted. Now, with the hum of the refrigerator filling the silence, Malik began to speak. He told her everything, not in a rush, not with drama, but carefully, like he was unfolding something fragile. The moment he was called to the board, the eyes, the whispers, the doubt, then the silence, the solving, the applause. He told her how Mrs. Thompson had apologized, how she had said he had a gift, how she wanted to help. He spoke in short, even sentences, but his eyes flickered with something he hadn't let her see before, pride. Maybe, or hope. His mother listened without interruption, her hands wrapped around her glass like it was the only thing anchoring her. She didn't blink much, just watched, and listened. And when he finally stopped, she didn't say anything right away. She reached across the table and placed her hand over his. Gently but firmly. Her palm was warm, her grip, solid, her eyes shimmered, but she didn't let a single tear fall. "I always knew," she said softly. "I've always known you were special. Baby, just needed the world to catch up." Malik didn't look away, didn't brush it off. He nodded slowly, the lump in his throat small but real. He didn't need her to believe in him, she always had. But hearing it now, after everything, felt different, like it had weight, like it mattered more. She squeezed his hand. They saw it today. That's just the beginning. He looked down at his notebook, fingers tracing the creased cover. For so long, it had held only numbers, puzzles, problems he solved in silence. But now, for the first time, he turned to a blank page and wrote something different. Not an equation, not a diagram, just a few words, written in small, careful letters. Apply to the math competition. He stared at the line for a moment, then smiled, not wide, not loud, just enough. His mother saw it, and smiled back. The kitchen stayed quiet, but the silence was full. And for the first time, the dream wasn't just in his head. It was on paper. It was real. The next morning, Malik walked into room 206 and felt it immediately, the shift. It wasn't loud or obvious, but it was there. The way heads turned when he entered. The way eyes lingered, not with ridicule or boredom, but with something closer to curiosity and respect. The kid who used to be a shadow in the corner now carried a different kind of presence. One that didn't demand attention but earned it just by being. A few classmates nodded at him. One boy from the back raised his hand in a small wave. Another leaned over and whispered, "Hey, you think you could help me with question 4 later?" And for the first time, Malik didn't flinch from the spotlight. He nodded, calm and cool, his old notebook tucked under one arm like it had always belonged there. Mrs. Thompson gave him a glance when he sat down, not sharp or cautious, but steady, warm. Later in the lesson, when she posed a difficult problem to the class and Malik raised his hand, her response came without hesitation. "Go ahead, Malik." No skepticism, no challenge in her tone. Just belief. He answered with quiet clarity. And the class listened, not just because he was right, but because now they wanted to understand how. And just like that, Malik wasn't the quiet kid anymore. He was the kid who saw the board differently. The one who proved brilliance doesn't need volume. The one who reminded them all that silence can be a kind of strength. By the end of the week, more students were coming to him, not just for math help, but with questions, with interest, with open minds. Mrs. Thompson, too, had changed. She started calling on the quieter students more, not assuming disinterest where she once had. Something had shifted in her teaching, sparked by a single moment of clarity from a boy who once kept to the margins. Malik still sat by the window. He still watched the breeze move through the trees during breaks between problems. But now, he wasn't alone in that quiet. Now, others leaned in to see what he saw. And maybe for the first time, he let them. What about you? Have you ever been underestimated? Or watched someone break through the limits others set for them? Let us know in the comments. We'd love to hear your story. Your voice might inspire our next video.